Chapter 4:15. It's a pity that I don't have a microscope. Otherwise, I'd be able to figure out the reason for this hardened blood. If it's only frozen because of my abnormal body temperature, there shouldn't be these orderly lines. Or perhaps this hardened blood is not caused by my body temperature, but because of its appearance. My body temperature is too low. Dean frowned and sighed in his heart. It was a pipe dream to make a microscope with the current industrial technology. He looked at Crone, who was rummaging in the bookshelf. Fine time to ask Noyce to bring back some medical books from various libraries. The more remote the better. Don't use the basic ones. In addition, tell him not only to bring back medical books but also other types of books. But don't bring too many. Just 1/5 of the medical books will do. Now our status is different. We have to be wary of villains. Our every move will be watched. But we must hide things that shouldn't be known by outsiders. Do you understand? Crone responded in doubt. He knew that Dudian chose Noyce because of his blonde hair. But he didn't understand why Dudian chose only 1/5 of the other book. Shouldn't the more the better? Crone knew that Dudian had chosen Noyce because of his blonde hair. He didn't ask because he knew that Dean wouldn't answer such a simple question. He had to figure out the answer himself. Crone found several medical books from the bookcase and put them in front of Dean. Dean was thinking as he flipped through the book. The source of the cold air comes from my abdomen. When I was captured by Splitter in his cave, Scar blocked Splitter's sharp blade for me. Scar cut off my waist and made a big hole in it. I was mixed with the corpses of other monsters, so the wound was infected by other monsters. Most of the people who got the ice blood disease in the past had contact with monsters. In the beginning, he had the immunity of the Defiler, magic marks, so he didn't have any abnormalities. But since he had the Splitter magic marks, his body had changed. The last time he came back from the giant wall, he felt that his body was a bit cold. But he didn't have a solution even though he knew the reason. Moreover, he didn't know how long he could live if he got this strange disease. God wants me to die prematurely. God is jealous of geniuses. Such a thing will fall on my head. God, don't you think too highly of me? Dean gently rubbed his fingers. There was a trace of coldness in his eyes. Several days passed in the blink of an eye. In the past few days Noyce used Dean's identity to borrow a lot of books. Most of them were medical books. The rest were miscellaneous books. There were books about the history of the giant wall, the barbarians' history, the biographies of legendary inventions, the fragments of classical music masters, and so on. How is the Melon Consortium these days? Dean casually asked Crone as he looked at the medical book in his hand. He tried to find the cause of the disease and diagnostic clues. He had no time to read the newspapers or understand the situation outside. Crone replied. Master, Melon Consortium collapsed after the old patriarch George was imprisoned. The Mel family has also plummeted. Their industries have been boycotted by the people. They are losing money every day. Many hotels, theaters, and other places in residential areas have been destroyed by mobs. It is estimated that they won't be able to hold on for long. Tell old Foulin to seize the opportunity. If the people's anger subsides, then it will take a lot of effort to completely destroy the Mel family, Dean said. Crone nodded as he sighed in his heart. He was a famous aristocrat in the outer wall. But now he was reduced to this point. He recalled the time when a little gardener of the Mel family went to the orphanage for adoption. He had the most prominent identity and was the object that everyone wanted to adopt. However, he was an old aristocrat after all. He didn't collapse even under the pressure of Dean. If it was any other small aristocrat, then their whole family would have been in prison by now. He said that it is forbidden to touch the soul crystal if there is a wound on his hand, so as to avoid being trapped inside the soul crystal. Unexpectedly, Dean was startled as he saw a medical case. It was about a clergyman, infected with ice blood disease. You need to take a lot of sugar. The staple food is beef. Take the medicine on time. You can live for 2 years or 1 week. If you don't pay attention to keeping warm, then your body temperature will be too low. Avoid touching cold water, black snow. Dean was struck by lightning as he read the last part of the case. 2 years at most? Short, 1 week? Isn't this the same as terminal cancer in the old era? He was stunned for a moment. He looked down again and again until he was sure that he wasn't wrong. He was at a loss. Did it mean that he had less than 2 years left? 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Countless sketches flashed through his mind. Each of them was the ideal in his heart. However, there was no way to realize these ideals. His heart was empty, and he was in a daze. Crone's face changed as he saw Dean's strange reaction. He looked at the book in Crone's hand and carefully asked, "Master, what's wrong?" Dean's eyes gradually focused. He was silent for a moment. "It's nothing. You go out first." Crone was worried. He wanted to say something but hesitated. He turned and left. He gently closed the door and quietly waited outside. Dean looked at the distance in a daze. His eyes were filled with confusion. A long time passed. The scenery outside gradually darkened. The night was reflected in his eyes. It seemed to add a bit of light. His eyes gradually recovered from the numbness. He looked down at the book in his hand. Sugar, beef, these are all high-calorie foods. According to the book, if I eat these high-calorie foods, I can suppress the outbreak time of the ice blood disease. If I eat food with more calories than sugar and beef, it should not be difficult for me to live for 2 years, or even longer. The people who got ice blood disease shouldn't be as strong as me. If my physique is higher, then my resistance will be enhanced. Maybe I can hold on for a longer time. Thinking of this, the despair in his heart gradually recovered a strong hope and desire, as well as a longing for life. In 2 years' time, I will master the medicine of the old era. Then I will try my best to find a solution. Even cancer has been solved. What is this? Terminal disease? It's just that it's an incurable disease in relative terms. Since it's called an incurable disease under such simple conditions, I'll change the world and these simple conditions. I'll make it an ordinary disease that can be easily treated. Dean's eyes glowed with tenacity. When he was captured by the splitter in the cave, he survived. How could he admit defeat for this little disease? "Crone!" Dean called out. Crone, who was guarding outside the door, hurriedly pushed the door. "Master, I'm here. In the future my clothes will be made of the best thermal materials, including my armor," Dean said. "In addition, from today on I will eat a piece of tooth crab rib for every meal." Crone was surprised. "Tooth crab? Master, this is one of the most expensive ingredients. It's taken from the front rib of the monster tooth crab. An adult tooth crab's front rib is only half a catty. It's only enough for 1 meal. Tooth crab is rare and difficult to catch. Nobles will snatch it as soon as it appears. They have to eat it every meal." "Is it difficult?" Dean's face turned cold. "Even if I have to sell dragon meat, I have to buy it. If anyone doesn't want to sell, then I will grab it." Chapter 4:16. Crone smiled as he hesitated. "I'll try my best, master." "It's not your best, but it's a must," Dudian added. "In addition to the tooth crab rib, my tableware needs to be made by the most expensive master. The water I drink must be purified water that has been repeatedly filtered." Crone was startled. He wanted to ask Dudian if there were any benefits to eating the tooth crab rib, but now it seemed that it was purely a matter of Dudian's own preference. Would people become so extravagant after they become rich and famous? He bowed his head. "Master, do you have any other orders?" Dean thought for a moment. "Inform the temple that I want the temperature in the lecture hall to be higher on the day of my public lecture. You can think about the reason yourself." "I know. I'll keep it a secret." Crone nodded with a trace of worry in his eyes. "Young master, are you feeling better? Teaching is very tiring, can you bear it?" "I won't fall that easily. Go and call Artemis." "Yes, master." Father, is Grandpa really not able to be bailed out? Sarah looked at Mark. Her eyes were red and swollen. She was full of pain and remorse. Mark sighed. I have contacted several generals in the military. It's impossible to bail him out. They can only let him live a better life in prison. He won't be humiliated. Sarah's tears fell as she clenched her fists and said, Father, let's send someone to assassinate him. Ron must have been ambushed by him. This time we will send everyone and certainly kill him. As long as he is dead, sooner or later we will be able to restore our original state. Then we will be able to bring Grandpa back. Stupid! Mark angrily rebuked her. Have you forgotten what I taught you in the past? The more dangerous the situation is, the calmer you are. Remorse and pain won't let you act recklessly. Assassinate him? Have you investigated how many people are protecting him in the dark? The military, the magistrate, the Holy Church, none of them will let him die. If he dies now, it doesn't matter if we kill him or not, we will be the first to bear their wrath. The Holy Church alone is enough to exterminate our entire race. Sarah's body trembled. The word extermination shook her heart. She instantly sobered up. Father, Mark coldly snorted. I have investigated in the past few days. On the day of Ron's accident, one of the 2 senior knights left the castle and went to the Moulin Rouge to have fun. The only one left was the woman who used to be a gold medal punisher. It's impossible to stop Ron unless there was a sneak attack. Or there are other masters hidden in this kid's hands. That person is probably the old butler. Sarah was startled. Father, you mean to say that he has 3 senior knight powerhouses helping him? Not bad. Moreover, this kid is an intermediate hunter. Coupled with the magic mark, he can barely fight against an ordinary senior hunter. He sighed and whispered, If you don't want to go back, then don't go. I won't force you. I won't force you to do things you don't want to do. As long as you are happy and do what you really like to do, you don't need to worry about the family. I will handle it. Jenny burst into tears as she choked with sobs. This is the bitter fruit that I have sown. Since the business failed, then I should bear the losses. Rudolph gently stroked Jenny's hair. I don't believe that I can't make the Bourong family rise again in the next 20 or 30 years of my life. Jenny wiped her tears as she looked up at him. I will work hard with you. Rudolph was startled. His eyes were slightly sparkling as he looked up and laughed. Well, let's work hard together. The butler hurriedly said after Jenny left. Master, the situation is critical now. That kid will be more powerful after the public lecture. He will crush us easily. Why did you stop Miss from interceding? Interceding will only make us more humble. Rudolph's smile disappeared as he slowly said, Moreover, he climbed all the way from prison to his current position. What did he rely on? It's not love but hate. Hate can make a person crazy. The motivation of hatred is far stronger than love. Chapter 4:17. Master, what do you mean? The butler was confused. Rudolph continued. Do you really think that he wants to retaliate against the Melon Consortium? Yes, everyone thinks so. But everyone is wrong. He doesn't want to deal with us because of resentment. He has no choice but to deal with us. The Melon Consortium is his only enemy. Moreover, it is an irreconcilable enemy. If he chooses to deal with other people, then he will have one more enemy. So he can only compete with the Melon Consortium. The choice is not in his hands. Moreover, in the eyes of the other consortiums, this is something that they are happy to see. If there is a chance, they might even help him and make this knife sharper. The butler was startled. After a moment he sighed. Master, he has changed from a weapon to a master. The Melon family has fallen. The next one will be us. Rudolph slowly said, Have you ever thought why the Mel family was the first to fall and not our Bourong family? The butler's eyes lit up. Master, are you saying that he still has feelings for Miss? That's why he didn't deal with us? If that's the case, doesn't that mean we can still? Rudolph squinted at him. When did you become so stupid? The butler was stunned. Do you really think that this monster still has feelings in his heart? Do you think that feelings can affect his judgment? Rudolph said in a cold voice. The butler's face slightly changed. Master, if he doesn't have feelings for Miss, then what is the reason? Rudolph said, there are two reasons for this. The first one is that he has feelings for Near. But in my opinion this possibility is so low that it can be ignored. Therefore, it can only be the second reason, and this reason also fits with his style of doing things. The second reason? In the past, he was just a weapon. The Scott Consortium was willing to help him in his fight against the Mellon Consortium. Other consortia were willing to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. If necessary, they would secretly help him. But now it's different. As you said, he has turned from a weapon to a master. Now that he is in the spotlight, he will have to face the attacks of other masters. Rudolph slowly said, for him the real battlefield has just begun. The other consortia won't tolerate the growth of such a monster. The military won't allow it and the Holy Church won't allow it. Once the New World Consortium continues to expand, it will annex the other 5 consortia. Then even the Holy Church and the military will have to step back. At that time he will no longer be a small consortium. He will be able to influence the structure of the military and the Holy Church. No matter which side he goes to, the other side will be a threat. This is not the situation that the military and the Holy Church are willing to see. Dean raised his eyebrows. Don't tell me that the entire outer wall doesn't sell it and you are looking for suppliers? As long as there is one, then send it to my table. Do you understand? Crone scratched his head and said, Young master, I heard that the Brandon family bought several toothed crabs for the banquet tonight. Go and buy them. Dean interrupted him. Crone carefully said, But master, the Brandon family is an upper-class aristocrat. They have a lot of properties under their command. If they don't want to sell. Chapter 4:18. Master, won't we offend people? Crone asked in a weak voice. Dudian indifferently said, If I offended you, then I offended you. Just do it. All right. Crone didn't expect Dudian to be so persistent about food. Should I ask Sergei to buy it now? Tell Noyce to go with him. Dudian said. Tell him to let the other party offer a price first. If he doesn't sell, then we will rob him. I want to see if he has the guts to not sell. Okay. Crone came to the hall and passed Dudian's words to Sergei and Noyce. Sergei asked, Did he really say that he will rob if he doesn't sell? Yes. Crone was very sure. Sergei was stunned. I didn't expect him to be a foodie. All right, I promise to bring it back for him. Sergei patted Noyce's shoulder and called him to take the horse. Both of them rode out of the castle and headed towards the Brandon family's territory. Lin, is the hall ready? Cage came down the stairs and looked at the busy attendants in the magnificent hall. He asked a tall girl who was talking to her maid. The girl was about 18 or 19 years old. She was wearing a luxurious golden dress which was embellished with countless crystal lights. It was extremely dazzling. One didn't need to think to know that this expensive evening dress was made by a master tailor. Father, it's almost ready. We're just waiting for the guests to arrive. When Lin Na heard her father's words, she gracefully walked over with a smile on her face. Cage laughed and said, Your Uncle William is coming today. I heard that his son is now a second-level Knight of Light in the temple. He also likes Mr. Hemming's music, which is the same as you. You should talk more about it at the banquet. Lin Er's face turned red. Dad, what are you talking about? Today's banquet is obviously prepared for you and Uncle William to congratulate him for his promotion. How can it be related to me? Silly child. Cage laughed. At this time, a middle-aged butler in a black tuxedo quietly came out of the crowd. He bowed and said, Master, there are 2 people outside who want to see you. They claim to be Master Dean's attendant. Master Dean? Cage was surprised. Lena's eyes lit up as she looked at the butler. Is it the genius Master Dean? The housekeeper said respectfully, Yes, Mississippi, is it really him? Lena was a little excited. She grabbed Cage's hand and said, Father, did you inform him? Is he also here to congratulate Uncle William? Cage was puzzled, but when he heard her words, his heart moved. He said to the housekeeper, Let them in. Yes, master. The butler turned and left. Lin Na's eyes were filled with excitement as she looked at the back of the housekeeper. Dad, it's my birthday in a few days. Can you invite Master Du to my birthday party? If he appears, my friends will be envious of me. I heard that Master Dean is not only skilled in divine arts, but he is also a gold knight. He is handsome and knows how to compose poems. He is perfect, Cage helplessly said. Don't think too much about it. Our Brandon family can't climb up to such a person. Lena slightly pouted as she heard her father pour cold water on her. What are you thinking about? I didn't say that I want to find him. I'm his admirer. I just want to see him in person. Cage helplessly shook his head and didn't say anything. At this moment, the butler returned from outside, followed by two tall and burly figures. One had golden hair, and the other had a burly figure. Judging from their clothes, they were indeed servants. He glanced at them and noticed that the two did not bring any gift. His heart was slightly moved. Greetings, Mr. Brandon Cage, Sergei politely said as he came in front of Cage. Cage smiled. Both of you are too polite. Please sit down. No need. Sergei whispered as he saw that no one was paying attention to them. Patriarch Cage, our young master asked us to visit you and ask for something. Ask for something? Cage was slightly startled. He asked calmly, What is it? Tooth crab. Sergei calmly said. Our young master has recently fallen in love with some delicious food. We have searched everywhere and heard that the last tooth crab in the market was bought by your servant. So we have come to ask for it. Patriarch Cage, please rest assured that we will pay 3 times the price for it. I hope you can help us. Cage and Lena looked at each other. They never thought that the other person would come to ask for an ingredient. So he likes to eat toothed crabs. Lin Na secretly noted this down, and her heart rippled. Cage slightly frowned as he pondered. Nowadays the situation outside was in constant turmoil. He knew that this talented young master was the main force that defeated the Melon Consortium. Every time a behemoth fell, the dust would cover the eyes of many people. However, the Brandon family was a powerful family. They knew what kind of changes would occur in the pattern of the commercial district. Patriarch? Sergei asked again as he saw that Cage didn't speak. Cage took a look at him and hesitated for a while. Then, he said in a deep voice, Go back and tell Master Du that this is an item for tonight's banquet. I'm sorry that I can't resell it. If Master Du likes it, I'll find it in a few days and send it to him. Sergei raised his eyebrows. Patriarch, you are too stingy. We are only asking for an ingredient. Moreover, we are asking for 3 times the price. Is the face of our young master so worthless? Or are you not going to give him face? Lena didn't expect her father to refuse. She pulled her father's arm. Dad, give it to them. We can replace it with something else. No. Cage's attitude was tough. This is the rule of our family. Moreover, the menu has been published. How can we change it at will? Sergei narrowed his eyes. Is that so? Patriarch, can you let us see the tooth crab? Isn't this request too much? Cage's face softened. No problem. He slowly put away the expensive menu. Master, some of these ingredients are very complicated. We don't have a professional chef. Even if we buy them, we won't be able to handle them well. It's easy to waste them. Do you want to hire one? Dudian replied. The hired person isn't trustworthy. In a few days there will be a new partner joining us. Buy some ingredients that are easy to make. Crone was startled. I know. Mr. Chai, that's it. Do you think I should send someone to ask him for an explanation? Cage slowly narrated what had happened and asked the middle-aged man in front of him. Chai's eyes flashed as he held a glass of red wine in his hand. I have already heard about this matter. The two men are indeed his attendants. He connived his men to rob us because he wanted to see our reaction. I didn't expect that he would move on to our Scott consortium. He really doesn't know the immensity of the heavens and earth. Cage frowned. Our consortium has cooperated with him many times. We shouldn't have offended him. Why did he choose us? Chai narrowed his eyes. It should be about the new textile machine. This kid is quite vengeful. New textile machine? Cage was startled for a moment. The new textile machine had tampered with their share. However, we only reduced their share for the first 2 months. After that, we still gave them the usual share. Why would they fall out with us? When he bailed out the senior hunter called Sergei, he offended the Krulov consortium. Why didn't he retaliate against them? Chai was silent for a moment. We can't let this matter go. Since he wants to test our reaction, then we will let him see. You go back and send someone to his door to ask for an explanation. I want to see how he will respond. I know. Cage nodded. Huasheng Consortium. Wallace family. Master, I just got the information that the Dark Church has issued a high reward for the assassination of the Genius Master. The butler said in a very light voice, Master, should we secretly push it? Hank folded the newspaper in his hand and smiled. No need. This kid is too young. He has just swallowed the melon consortium and hasn't digested it yet. Now he has provoked the Scott consortium. I thought that he would form an alliance with the Scott consortium. It seems that I was worried for nothing. I remember that the Scott consortium had tampered with the new textile machine. I wanted to give this to him to sow discord between them. It seems that he already knows about this matter. The butler looked at the newspaper in Hank's hand and said, He picked the banquet to cause trouble for the Brandon family. Is he trying to test the reaction of the Scott consortium? The Brandon family has lost their face. They will certainly look for him for an explanation. Let's see how he responds. Master, what about our previous plan? Put it aside for the time being. We will wait until they are tired and then we will act. Green Consortium. Croton family. Pass down the order. All the properties in the civilian area will remain the same. The previous plan will be temporarily cancelled. I want to observe the situation. Curtin Steve tapped his thigh and took a sip of coffee as he spoke to a well-dressed young man beside him. The young man was startled. Yes, Master. Chapter 420. Master, the cage you want to build is cast. Crone went upstairs to report to Dudian. Dudian nodded slightly. His eyes didn't leave the book. Let Sergei send it to the giant wall. Moreover, call Patriarch Fulin to come over. There are important things to discuss. Yes, Master. Crone turned away. Ryan family's carriage stopped in front of the castle after half a day. Old Fulin and Sander got off together. There were 3 knight attendants. 1 was a gold knight and 2 were silver knight. Weapons are not allowed in the hall. Noyce, who was on duty at the door, stopped them. The 3 knights frowned and turned to look at Old Fulin. Old Fulin nodded. The 3 knights frowned but still took off their weapons and handed them to Noyce. Patriarch Fulin, please. Master has been waiting for you for a long time. Crone invited Old Fulin in a humble manner. Old Fulin nodded and indicated that the 3 knights didn't need to follow him. He held Sander's wrist and asked him to help him to go upstairs. Sander hesitated but silently helped Old Fulin. Crone opened the door and looked at Dudian. Master, Patriarch Fulin has arrived. You go out first. Dudian didn't look up. Crone nodded and gestured to Old Fulin and Dudian to enter the room. He quietly closed the door and waited for them to enter the room. It's so warm here. Old Fulin looked at the fireplace and smiled at Dudian. Dudian used a pen to make a mark on the paper. He folded the corner and closed the book. He looked at old Foulin, who was sitting on the sofa, and Sander, who was standing next to him. He smiled. Patriarch, I haven't seen you for a few days. How are you? I'm quite healthy. Old Foulin laughed and leaned his crutches against the sofa. He looked at Dudian. I heard that you had a friction with the Brandon family yesterday. Do you need me to help you settle it? That's not why I called you here. Dean smiled, got up and tightened his coat. He came to the sofa and sat down. He took out the tea leaves from the drawer under the coffee table. He picked up the thermal teapot and gently brewed a cup of tea. First he washed the tea, shook it and brewed it. He poured the water into the tea gutter and filtered it into the sink under the table. Then he filled it with tea. The fragrance of the tea was refreshing. Old Foulin was surprised. If your hair wasn't black, I would have suspected that you were born in a noble family. Dean smiled and poured himself a cup. Everyone can learn etiquette. If the library is open to civilians, then the so-called untouchables in the eyes of the aristocracy will be much less. Old Foulin smiled but didn't reply. Dean didn't intend to talk about this matter in depth. He went straight to the point. Patriarch, how is the recovery of the Melon Consortium? Everyone pushes the wall when it's down. Old Foulin took a sip of tea and whispered. Under your banner, the aristocrats of the Melon Consortium have withdrawn their investment and joined our consortium. But a small part of them have been poached by other consortiums. As for the rest, they won't be able to resist for long. They have framed you and caused public anger. So the people have boycotted all the industries under the Melon Consortium. You know, if you don't make a profit, then it's equal to a loss. If they continue to lose money, then they will soon collapse. Dean nodded. What about the Mel family? That old guy George went to prison. There is no way to bail him out. The prestige of Mel family is not as good as it used to be. It has changed from a bright star to a dim meteorite overnight. The only shining sparks are the friction caused by the rapid fall. Old Foulin smiled. The Melon Consortium is completely unable to make a comeback. The Mel family is preparing to declare bankruptcy and start all over again. Dean nodded. We have to cut the weeds and eliminate the roots. Old Foulin looked at him. I will. After stabilizing the industries of the Melon Consortium, we will manage it well. Dean took a sip of his tea. From now on I won't provide any practical help to the consortium. Everything will depend on you, Patriarch. Old Foulin was startled. This? Why? Sandro, who was at the side, was also taken aback. He asked anxiously, Yes, why? Our momentum is good. The people believe in us. We can attack any consortium, and they won't be able to fight back. If you provide us with inventions in the future, we can even rule the outer wall. Dean looked up at him. Rule the outer wall? You guys are thinking quite far ahead. Don't forget, above the financial groups are the military and the Vatican. Sandro was stunned and asked in confusion, the military and the church? They won't intervene in this matter. Moreover, we have annexed other consortiums, so they can't do anything to us. Dean looked at old Foulin. Patriarch, it seems that the outside world is calm. There are only sounds of us nibbling at the Melon Consortium. However, the other consortiums are ready to go. If we continue to expand, then the military and the Holy Church won't sit idly by. They need balance, and we will break the balance. That's why the temple forbids the masters to have close contact with the aristocracy. Even the masters from the aristocracy can't open the back door to provide unbalanced help to their families. Of course, there are inevitably some masters who have close relationships with consortiums over the years, but they only help a little. If they really sell divine spells to consortiums time and time again and provide too much help, the temple will not turn a blind eye to it. You should understand the stakes involved. Old Foulin looked at Dean. According to you, we won't compete with other consortiums in the future. But what if other consortiums compete with us? We'll fight in whatever way we should, Dean said. If they find fault with us, then we will fight back. There will inevitably be frictions and conflicts in business. But I won't do anything. Do you understand that I'm the one who will crush the scales? But don't worry. Although I won't help, but everyone knows that I'm from the New World Consortium. You have done me a great favor, so they won't provoke you too much. Moreover, you can use my reputation to operate. It's more than enough to deal with the other consortiums. Old Fulin sighed. There was regret and unwillingness in his heart. However, he was aware of the urgency of the situation. Although it was the universal truth to strive to move up, but if he continued to move forward, he might fall off the cliff. And the cliff was in front of them. I know. Don't worry. Even if you don't help us, as long as you are alive, we only need to borrow your reputation to become the biggest commercial plutocrat in the commercial district. Old Fulin said. Dean smiled and continued to pour tea for him. What are you going to do in the future if you don't create inventions? Old Fulin asked while drinking tea. Dean smiled. There are a lot of things I can do. With my current status, I'm already a master of my faction. Once my gas faction is stabilized, then my status will be much higher than that of a legendary master. I'm afraid that I'll destroy the world if I continue to study. Destroy the world? Old Fulin and Sander were surprised. Wasn't this a bit too big? Dean didn't elaborate. I will teach and train a group of excellent students. Even if one day I'm gone, no one will dare to touch the New World Consortium as long as they are there. That's true. Old Fulin nodded. You are very young, but your thinking is very far. I'm an old man who has half of my body in the soil. I haven't thought about what will happen after death. Dean glanced at Zendral and smiled. The plan is always long-term. Old Fulin sighed. We may be able to go further if there is no suppression from the military and the Holy Church. Unfortunately, the system of the world is like this. You can't climb up just because you have the ability. No one is willing to share their bowl of meat with others. We are the same. We trample on the people who have the hope to climb up under our feet. We don't want them to threaten us. The temple is better. As long as a genius like you has the talent, you will be able to stand out. Your talent won't be buried. Dean's heart was touched. In fact, any system is the same. If you want to climb up, then it's not enough to be stronger than others. You have to be much stronger in order to rush up. Old Fulin sighed. A supreme ruler often needs several generations of contacts and wealth accumulation to turn over. Our foundation is too thin compared to the Holy Church, which has existed for hundreds of years. I hope that the next generation can really rise. Dean looked at him. Patriarch, you are old, but your heart isn't. If the heart is old, then it's useless. Dean received the news that the Burong family had come to visit after sending off Old Fulin. Dean didn't bother to see them, so Crone was in charge. Master, the people from the Burong family have returned. They came to send gift. This is their gift. Crone came to the study room and handed a gift box to Dean. The gift box was opened and there was a contract inside. I was worried that it was a dangerous item, so I opened it without authorization. Crone explained. Dean said, Check it in front of me. Yes, Master. Chapter 421. Give this to Old Fulin. Tell him to send people to recover the land. Dean threw the contract to Crone. Also send a letter to the Burong family. Don't let me hear the words Burong family again. Otherwise I'll make them completely disappear from the commercial district. Crone took the contract. He didn't dare to ask more but bowed his head. Dean continued to read the book after Crone left. Holy Church, military. Their foundation should be in the inner wall. I have to know their details if I want to defeat them. Dean's eyes lit up. Inner wall. It's time to take a look. Dean had just finished his lunch when he heard the sound of a carriage coming from outside the manor. Dean looked through the window and saw that it was his family's carriage. At this time, the door of the carriage was pushed open. Nicholas's figure slowly came down from the carriage. He turned around and made a gentleman's invitation gesture. Several figures jumped down from the carriage. Dean stood up and strode towards the door. Gwyneth, who was next to him, wasn't scared by his sudden movement. She put down the knife and followed behind Dean like a shadow. She was waiting for him at the door. Dean! A few figures jumped down from the carriage. One of them was a burly teenager. He was overjoyed when he saw Dean. He shouted from afar and ran towards him. Dean smiled. The burly teenager threw himself into Dean's arms and gave him a big hug. I haven't seen you for a few years. You've grown a lot. Dean loosened his hand and hammered the teenager's chest. The burly teenager was his best friend from the scavenger training, Mason. Mason grinned and said, I have heard that you are now a very powerful master. The newspapers are full of news about you every day. Among us brothers, you are the best. Not only have you become a master, but you are also a golden knight of the Knight's Hall. I heard that a golden knight is much more powerful than a hunter. Even a senior hunter of a consortium may not be able to beat a golden knight. Mason grinned and said, How can it be compared to your changes? I have heard that you are now a very powerful master. Dean shook his head. I'm a golden knight. There's a difference between an honorary knight and a real golden knight. In short, there's a difference between me and a real golden knight. There are so many crooked things. I want to know whether an honorary knight is powerful or not. Of course. Dean laughed. Gwyneth looked at the back of the teenager in front of her. There was a trace of surprise in her eyes. She had followed Dean for a long time. She knew that the latter paid great attention to his identity and manners. She didn't expect him to say such vulgar words. Mason, you bastard! How can you run so fast? A shout came from behind. Dean and Macon looked over and saw a handsome teenager supporting a plain-dressed teenager with an ordinary face. They were coming together. Zach. Sham? Dean was startled. Although a few years had passed and they had grown a lot, but there was still the shadow of their childhood. However, he noticed that Sham's leg was broken. Moreover, it was sawed off from the thigh, and the lower half did not have a prosthesis. Dean. Zach laughed as he helped Sham to come over. Sham saw that Dean was wearing simple but luxurious clothes. There was a bit of shame on his face. He couldn't help but say, Dean is a master of the temple and a golden knight. We can't call him Dean anymore. Zach responded, Yes, let's call him Master Dean. What do you think? Mason looked at the two. What nonsense are you talking about? It's awkward. Dean is called Dean. Why are you calling him like an outsider? Am I right, Dean? Dean sobered up. Whatever you want to call me. Sham, what happened to your leg? This, Zach said. We were attacked by a monster when we were scavenging. Sham's leg was bitten and infected with a highly toxic poison. We couldn't detoxify it, so we cut off his leg and saved his life. The smile on Sham's face was somewhat forced as he said, It's good to be cut off. I have no value. I was fired by the consortium, but I can go back to my hometown to help my father take care of the pub. Although I haven't done anything, but at least my physique is a bit stronger than ordinary people. In my area, I'm known as the one-legged king. Macon laughed and said, Then if we go, wouldn't we be the king of legs? Sham snappily said, I'll make you a ham king. Zach clapped his hands. I agree. Dean smiled. After a few years, they were still as close as before. However, Sham seemed to have changed. In his mind, although he could trust all three of them, but there were differences. Mason was the one he trusted the most, followed by Sham. His mind was flexible, but he was honest. Zach was a bit irritable and selfish. Although he had nothing to say to them, but to outsiders he was the type of person who would not help others. Everything was based on his own interests. Although he has now become such a person, but in the beginning, he preferred to talk to Sham. But this time, his feeling has changed. Zach seems to have become a lot more generous. Mason is still as heartless as before. But Sham seems to be a lot more sophisticated, hiding some things in his heart. Perhaps this was the reason why he was fired by the consortium. It was inevitable that things would become complicated if he came into contact with people outside the pub. Thinking of this, he sighed in his heart. However, when he thought of how they had helped each other during training and how they had saved each other during the trial, his heart still felt warm. He said, "Let's go in first. From today onwards you will follow me. What do you think?" Macon laughed. "When we came here, I heard the old man say that I didn't want to stay in that broken consortium for a long time. He didn't see us as human beings. He didn't want to see me. Then he drove me out." The youth replied in an aggrieved tone. "Bastard!" Cage slammed his palm on the table and glared angrily. "You robbed my food at my banquet. You clearly want to rob the property of my Brandon family, and now you want to expel my people? Damn you! You're just a brat who hasn't even grown hair yet. What bullsh *T master? You've just obtained a bit of power and you want to go to heaven." The youth was scared. He bowed his head and didn't speak. "Prepare the car. I'm going to the Chai family," Cage said in an angry voice. The young attendant felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and he responded before turning around and running away. Chapter 422. Are you going to start a war with the Scott Consortium? Glenn couldn't help but ask Dean after Crone went out. She suddenly realized the purpose of Dean's recruitment. She didn't expect that she would be involved in a more vicious struggle after leaving a consortium. Dudian smiled but didn't speak. He didn't deny it. It was equivalent to acquiescence. Glenn stared at him. "The Mellon Consortium has a very wide network of relationships. You haven't fully recovered them yet. Aren't you too anxious to deal with the Scott Consortium?" Dudian smiled. "I have a sense of propriety. You don't have to feel the pressure. You will be my private hunters in the future. You won't belong to the consortium, so you don't need to follow the rules and regulations of the consortium. Of course, your remuneration will be 3 times that of the Mellon Consortium. At the same time, I will incorporate you into my personal knight team. You will be an aristocratic knight. Although it's only an aristocratic knight, but it is a relatively decent identity. If you can pass the assessment of the Knights Hall, then you will be able to transfer to an official knight status. I will help you get rid of your hunter registration." Glenn was startled as she looked at the youth next to her. Glenn couldn't help but ask, "Help us get rid of the hunter registration? Really?" Although their registration was written as civilians, but there was a special symbol behind it. This special symbol represented the hidden registration. In other words, it was the registration of hunters. The taxes paid by hunters were much higher than that of civilians. Moreover, once they committed a crime, they would be severely punished. Most importantly, the registration of hunters didn't allow them to get pregnant and have children. These policies were like shackles that clamped down on the throat of the hunters. This was the reason why the hunter profession had continued for so many years since the Vatican era. But it was difficult to form a scale. Without the right to get pregnant, it was impossible to form a direct family and family system. They could only fight alone. If they were injured, they could rely on their relationship to apply for a position as an instructor or a senior member of the consortium. Otherwise, they could only die outside the giant wall. Glenn's eyes were slightly red. She suddenly got up and bowed to Dudian. "Thank you." There were no words of awe, but it was full of sincerity. "Thank you, Master Dean." The young man stood up and bowed gratefully. Dean accepted both of them. "In the future, you can call me the same as them. I'm in a high position now. I don't know how many people want me dead. As my personal knights, your lives will be threatened at any time. Are you willing?" "Yes," Glenn said without hesitation. "Me too," the young man said quickly. Dean showed a satisfied smile. "Sit down." The two of them sat down. Mason, Zack and Sham were puzzled as they saw Glenn and Glenn's excited appearance. In the minds of scavengers, hunters were high and mighty. They couldn't wait to become hunters one day. They didn't expect these two famous senior hunters to be excited because of the removal of their hunter status. It was hard to understand. Dean turned to look at the three. "What are your plans for the future?" Mason smiled. "As long as you don't want me to be a scavenger, then I'll follow you. Is being a hunter not good? If that's the case, then I'll be your knight." Dean smiled. "You will die at any time if you want to be my knight. If I die, I'll certainly block the knife for you. That's worth it." Mason grinned. "During the trial, my life was pulled back by you several times. Without you, I would have died." Dean's eyes slightly moved. There was a bit of warmth in his heart. He didn't expect that Mason would still remember it in his heart. "Me too," Zack also called out. Sham was a bit nervous as he saw both of them open their mouths. He said to Dean, "I also want to, but I don't know." "My legs," Dean smiled. "There is no need to be a knight. I'm short of a chef. If you don't mind, then you can be my chef. Last time someone tried to poison me and almost succeeded. I'll let you be my chef so that I can eat in peace." Hearing this, Mason and the other two were shocked. Glenn and the youth squinted their eyes. "Poison you? Melon Consortium? So vicious." Macon was angry. Zack couldn't help but look at the teacup in his hand. He subconsciously put it back on the table. "Sham, are you willing?" Dean asked. Sham was startled. "I'm willing. My family also runs a pub. But I'm not good at cooking, so I hope you don't mind. You can learn from me. I'm very picky." Dean smiled. "I'll invite a chef from a big hotel to teach you. Practice well." Sham scratched his head. "I know." Dean looked at the wall clock and said to Crone, "Call Gabriel and Artemis to come down." Crone went upstairs. After a while, he brought Gabriel and Artemis downstairs. "Introduce yourselves," Dean said. Gabriel and Artemis glanced at the crowd. Artemis was a little shy, and there was a trace of timidity in her eyes. Gabriel seemed to know his sister's timidity. He took the lead and loudly introduced himself. After the introduction, he gave his younger sister Artemis an encouraging look. Artemis followed her brother's style and introduced herself. "They are orphans that I brought back from the war-torn areas outside the Golden Wall." Dean looked at the youth next to Glenn. "Dennis, I will trouble you to teach Gabriel combat in the future. I have a guard who is also a senior hunter. His name is Sergey. He will be outside the giant wall for the next few days, and it will take some time for him to come back. You should assist him." Dennis got up. "Yes, young master." Glenn's mouth curved into a smile. "I have heard about your hunter called Sergey. He had committed a crime and was imprisoned in Thornflower Prison. I saw him fighting outside the Golden Wall. His fighting style is fierce and violent. Dennis's fighting style is more flexible. He likes to use tricks. If this child had learned from Mr. Sergey, then he should be tutoring Dennis. Don't let him go back to his old ways." "It's okay. I'm still practicing the basics." Dean smiled and said to Gabriel, "Let Uncle take you to practice." Gabriel nodded and stepped forward. "Sir, please teach me." Dennis was satisfied as he saw that the boy wasn't shy. "Then lead the way." Gabriel bowed, turned around, and led him upstairs. Glenn watched them leave. Her eyes fell on Artemis. There was a trace of curiosity in her eyes. "I've never seen such green hair. Where did this child come from?" "Probably a mixed blood from different regions," Dean casually said. He saw that Glenn was still looking at Artemis. "Are you interested in teaching her your assassination skills?" Glenn glanced at him. "Have you had such an idea for a long time?" Dean laughed. "I quite like her. I'll teach her then." Glenn stood up and squatted in front of Artemis. "Little girl, I'll teach you some real skills so that you can beat your brother in the future. How about it?" Artemis looked at Glenn's beautiful face. "I don't want to fight with my brother." Glenn was startled. There was a touch of softness in her eyes. She reached out and touched Glenn's head. She picked up Glenn's arm and looked at Dean. "Can I go anywhere in the castle?" Dean took a sip of tea. "In addition to my study room." "Understood." Glenn immediately took Artemis's hand and left. Artemis followed her step by step. She looked back at Dean from time to time. Dudian waited for the two to go far, then turned to Mason and the other two. You won't blame me for picking you up now, right? The three were startled. Macon shook his head. How can that be? Zack and Shem chuckled. Dean saw that although the two were smiling naturally, but there was a bit of mixed feelings in their eyes. He continued, You should know about my situation. I was framed by the Mellon Consortium. I had to rely on the shelter of the Ryan family to develop. I was helpless at that time. I didn't know when the Mellon Consortium would crush me. I didn't pick you up because I didn't want to implicate you. Now that the Mellon Consortium has been destroyed, I have the ability to protect myself. I don't have to worry about being inadvertently obliterated. Mason and the other two were shocked. They felt ashamed and touched. Dean, we know your intentions. Macon bowed his head. Zack and Shem nodded but didn't speak. Dean was relieved as he saw that the three listened to his words. He didn't want to have any gap between him and his three childhood friends. During dinner, Dean received a custom-made thermal armor from a master tailor. At first glance, they looked like very slight sawteeth, but when he looked closely, he found that they were tiny inverted thorns. There was no doubt that once this sharp blade that was covered in thorns pierced into the body of another demon, it would definitely cause the other party to feel excruciating pain when it was pulled out, tearing their bodies apart. However, this was both an advantage and a disadvantage. Although it could cause more wounds and bleeding when it was pulled out, the speed at which it was pulled out would be slower. If it was in a group battle, it was very likely that they would be pinned down because of the slow pull-out. However, if it was a sharp limb like the Great Splitter, stabbing and pulling out were incomparably fast. Even if it was an army of thousands of men and horses, it would still be able to charge forward and harvest at will. Dean was puzzled. How could there be such a difference between Splitter's sharp limbs and other splitters? Was it because of the way he fed the splitter was different? Or was it because of some unknown factors caused by hunger? Soon, Splitter ate almost all the viscera of the crocodile. Only the skin was left. It didn't continue to eat but put the skin of the crocodile under its body. It looked at Dean with vigilance. It's time for you to move. Dean took a deep look at the splitter. He pulled out the wooden stakes under the chains one by one. When the second chain was loosened, Splitter pushed the cage. The cage rolled over and rushed towards Dean. Dean dodged and moved to the other side of the chain and pulled it out. Bang! Splitter moved the cage towards Dean. Under Splitter's struggle, the last chain was pulled out from the ground and dragged on the ground. Dean grabbed the chain in his hand and jumped to the basement. He struggled to pull out the cage. The cage had just moved to the door when Splitter rushed towards Dean. Its body collided with the cage and the door. Bang! The door, which was made of concrete, suddenly broke. Dean pulled the chain and pulled the cage to run in the wilderness. Splitter squeaked in the cage as if he was very angry. Dean's arms were sore after running for more than 10 miles. He had to sit down to rest. Splitter struggled fiercely in the cage, banging against the cage with a loud noise. Dean shook his head. I shouldn't have fed you first. Now you have the strength to toss around, right? Splitter stopped struggling as it stared at Dean with its bloody compound eyes. Dean looked at the Splitter as he rested. In the silence, Splitter pounced on the cage. The sharp blades stretched out from the edge of the cage and stabbed towards Dean. But the distance was too short. Dean smiled as he got up and patted the dust off his buttocks. A few hours later, Dean finally dragged the Splitter to a fortress where the Holy Church was stationed. The night was deep and there was a fire tower on the fortress. Dudian crouched in the grass and looked around. He noticed that there was a hidden red heat in the grass nearby. It was the hidden sentries of the stronghold. Their camouflage was excellent. Their bodies exuded the smell of green grass. Unless one had an extremely sensitive sense of smell, even a senior hunter wouldn't be able to smell them. Dean jumped over the sentries hidden in the grass and finally found a relatively spacious gap where no sentries were stationed. There was a smile on his face as he pulled the splitter and quietly ran over. The splitter screamed from time to time along the way but gradually got tired. It sat in the cage and allowed Dean to drag it. Squeak! Splitter called out in vain as Dean passed through the gap in the grass. Whoosh! Dudien's saws suddenly exerted force as he quickly ran. Clang! The messy chains at the back touched the cage and clanked. Dean didn't know if the sentries who were thousands of meters away could hear him, but he didn't care too much as he ran at full speed. After running for a few miles, Dean heard a lot of footsteps coming from behind. He knew that the people stationed in the stronghold were alarmed. He couldn't help but sigh. He came to the front of the cage and whipped the chains. The splitter retreated slightly as it saw Dean's momentum. Dudien quickly took out the key and opened the lock of the cage. He looked at the direction of the sound and judged the distance between the two sides. After a few seconds, he opened the door of the cage and ran away. Squeak! The splitter was stunned as it looked at the door that was opened. It paused for half a second before it reacted. It screamed and rushed out. Clang! At the same time it rushed out of the cage, it waved its sharp blade to vent its anger and overturned the cage. Stop! Who is it? Stop! This is the luminous church. Stop right now and surrender. Chapter 424. Whoosh! Whoosh! Suddenly, several arrows were shot and nailed into the weeds beside Splitter. The blood-colored compound eye on Splitter's carapace moved slightly, and the dot in the center of the compound eye moved backward. Its body, which was as ferocious as a devil, slowly turned around and pounced forward like a fierce tiger. Its sharp limbs pushed its body forward like a spider. Like a fluffy seaweed, Splitter was caught up in the pursuing team. What is this? Monster! It's a monster! All of a sudden, blood-curdling screams resounded. Countless flesh and bones were cut and torn apart. Splitter rushed into the group of Knights of Light. Its seaweed-like body was like a meat grinder. Its sharp blade easily pierced through the chest armor of the Knights of Light. Its movement was swift and violent. The blood-red compound eyes on the carapace moved slightly as it easily dodged the attacks coming from all directions. Dean ran for hundreds of meters and looked back to see the one-sided massacre. He frowned and sighed. He took out his dagger and quietly returned to the front of the cage to watch the battle. Don't panic. Open the shield formation. A young knight riding on a white horse shouted angrily. His handsome face was filled with fear as he anxiously shouted at the defeated troops in front of him. However, under the fast attack of Splitter, these well-trained Knights of Light were already scared out of their wits. How could they care about his shouts? They turned around and ran away. The young knight was anxious and angry. He gritted his teeth, grabbed his bow, nocked an arrow, and shot. Whoosh! The arrow hit the sharp blade of Splitter and bounced off. The sudden attack attracted little Splitter's attention. The blood-red compound eyes on its carapace slightly rotated and locked on the young knight in the crowd. Suddenly, it pounced towards the young knight. Along the way, it brandished its sharp blade and chopped off the bodies of the knights who couldn't dodge in time. It was as easy as cutting tofu. Along the way, there were many bodies that were cut in half and miserable shriek. It was like an Azura hell. The young knight, who had never seen such a ferocious monster, turned pale with fright and clutched the reins of his horse. Seeing the little Splitter coming straight at him, he gave a loud cry, pulled the reins, and turned his horse to run away. Da-da-da! The well-trained warhorse ran away in panic. Splitter chased after it. The distance between the two was getting shorter and shorter. In the blink of an eye, Splitter had caught up with it. It squeaked angrily and thrust its sharp blade-like limbs into the horse's tail. Splitter's tail was pierced into the horse's body. The healthy horse neighed in pain, raising its front hooves high in the air as it cried out miserably. Splitter quickly pulled out its sharp blade and completely tore the wound open. Intestines and blood flowed out. The warhorse was too injured. It fell down with a painful neigh. Splitter ignored the warhorse and pounced on the young knight on the ground. The young knight looked at the ferocious and huge body. He was so scared that his hair stood on end. He regretted it. He never thought that it would be such a ferocious monster that smuggled over. If he had known, he wouldn't have chased after them even if he was beaten to death. Whoosh! In desperation, he waved his sword to resist, but only managed to parry the two sharp blades of Splitter. The other blades on Splitter's back pierced through the young knight's shoulders, head, neck, thighs, and other parts of his body like seaweed. He died instantly. He didn't even have time to let out a scream. Splitter roared and pounced on the young knight's body. It roared and gnawed on the young knight's body. The surrounding Knights of Light fled in fear as they saw the scene. In the blink of an eye, there were only a few knights whose bodies had been chopped off. They were wailing in pain and rolling on the ground. Some of them had been chopped off from the abdomen. They clenched their teeth in pain and used their hands to crawl on the ground to hide in the bushes. Dean shook his head as he saw that the battle was over. He glanced at the battlefield and bent down to pick up a few stones from the ground. He aimed at the seriously injured figures who were trying to sneak into the grass to hide. He threw the stones at them. Puff, puff, puff. The stone flew out and pierced through the head of a knight who had just crawled into the grass. The knight's helmet was dented and he didn't make any sound. Several survivors were killed by Dean. Splitter heard the movement and turned its head to look at Dean. It roared in anger. It abandoned the young knight who was bitten on the face and chest and rushed towards Dean. Dean pulled the chain of the cage and continued to run. There was no Splitter in the cage, so it didn't take much effort to pull the chain. Nevertheless, the distance between him and Splitter was getting closer. Dean stopped after running for 700 or 800 meters. He saw Splitter chasing after him. His mouth curved into a smile. He grabbed the iron frame of the cage as he looked at Splitter. The latter was like a train that was rushing at full speed. Dean clenched his fingers. He turned around and rotated the cage as the Splitter rushed towards him. The twisting force caused by his feet and waist pulled the cage horizontally. He swung the cage 180 degrees and hit the Splitter. Bang! The opening of the cage was aimed at the Splitter. The Splitter's body crashed into the cage. At the moment of impact, Dean swung the inertia of the cage and his body was deflected. He rolled on the ground 7 or 8 times before coming to a stop. While rolling, Dean pressed the door of the cage and fastened the lock. When the cage stopped rolling, Dean stepped on the tungsten steel column and jumped back, stepping on the tungsten steel chain on the ground. Squeak! The little Splitter got up again when it finished rolling. Seeing that it was locked in this damn cage again, it couldn't help but let out an extremely loud and angry roar. Dean bent down to pick up the tungsten steel chain from the ground. He dragged the cage and continued to walk. The little Splitter fiercely struggled in the cage and screamed in anger. Dean didn't care as he dragged the little Splitter and ran through the grass. 10 minutes later, Dean once again saw the towering giant wall. He saw a little fire in front of the giant wall. He quietly approached it and saw that it was the entrance to the giant wall. There was a team of Knights of Light standing guard outside the entrance. Scott Consortium, it's you. Dean narrowed his eyes. The entrance to the giant wall wasn't the one he rented but the one belonging to the Scott Consortium. It was the only entrance that he could safely transport Splitter to the area outside the giant wall. Whoosh! Dean dropped the chain and took the dagger. He pulled out a piece of black cloth and covered his face. Dean rushed over after getting close to a certain distance. Who is it? Stop. There's an enemy attack. Send a message. The Knights of Light who were guarding the entrance were scared as they saw the masked figure jump out. But their reaction wasn't slow. They quickly formed a circle and stared at Dean with their swords and shields. Dean quickly rushed over. When he was about 7 or 8 meters away, he suddenly threw the dagger. The dagger pierced through the forehead of a knight. The latter didn't have time to react. He didn't have time to move the shield to his head, so he suddenly fell down. Kill! Several knights roared and rushed over. Dean raised his hand and grabbed a spear that was stabbing towards him. His body rotated and his arms exerted strength. He lifted the spear and swept it towards the surrounding people. The knight was shocked as he didn't expect the strength of the enemy to be so fierce. He let go of the spear. At the same time, Dean grabbed the spear and swept it like a dragon. The spear instantly pierced the throat of a knight and hit the shield of another knight. The heavy force pressed on the shield and the knight fell to the ground. He knelt in front of Dean. Dean pushed the spear with his arm and quickly rushed out. The spear swung away the attacks from the surrounding people. He flew up and kicked the man's shield. Bang! The man's body flew out and fainted on the ground. Dean waved the spear and quickly killed. In the blink of an eye, the 8 knights on duty fell down. There was a huge difference in physique between the two sides. They didn't have the strength to fight back. Dean came to the knight who was stabbed by the dagger. Chapter 425. Mr. Hunter! Mr. Hunter! At this time, the other 2 people who were sitting near the campfire also ran over. They were a charming girl and a middle-aged man. They saw Dudian dressed in black armor and bowed their heads respectfully. Dudian didn't pay attention to them but stared at the sturdy boy. There was a trace of thinking in his eyes. Suddenly he thought of a person and couldn't help but be startled. His mood was a bit complicated. Lorien, this name was often heard when he was in the scavenger special training. Lorien was one of the members who trained with him. Lorien's performance was second only to him. Lorien was not convinced of him and often compared with him. He vaguely remembered that among all the students, Lorien was the first to be selected by a consortium. And the consortium that selected him was the Scott Consortium. He didn't expect that a few years would pass in the blink of an eye. Unexpectedly, he would unexpectedly meet an acquaintance here. Mr. Hunter, are you out to perform a task? Lorien saw that Dudian kept looking at him. He was a bit nervous and cramped, but he still asked in a flattering tone. His voice had just fallen when the sound of metal colliding echoed in the passage. Dean took back his thoughts. He saw the surprised look on the faces of several people. He sighed in his heart. His fingers hooked the dagger in the scabbard on his thigh and quickly cut it. Blood appeared on Lorien's throat. Dudien's sudden move shocked the 3 people. Lorien felt the pain in his throat and immediately covered his neck. He felt warm blood overflow from the wound. His heart couldn't help but panic. He pressed the wound and slowly retreated. He looked at Dudian in front of him in fear. Sorry, you can only blame your bad luck. Dean sighed and slowly said. Lorien's eyes widened as he slowly fell down and lost his breath. The girl and the middle-aged man next to him were scared and stunned on the spot. Puff, puff. Dean didn't wait for the 2 to speak. The dagger quickly stabbed out, and a bloody hole appeared on their throats. They stared in horror and fell down. Dean put the dagger into the scabbard and pulled out Splitter from the chain. He looked at the 3 bodies on the ground. His mood was a bit complicated. In the past he had killed strangers, so he didn't have too deep feelings. But tonight he had killed an acquaintance from his childhood. Although the latter often compared himself with him, but he didn't do anything too bad. But now he had died in his hands. Creak. Splitter smelled the blood and struggled in the cage. Dean retracted his gaze and dragged it along the giant wall. The dark night was silent. The sound of insects could be faintly heard in the weeds. Roars could be heard in the distance. The sounds were hoarse and trembling, making strange sounds that made one's scalp go numb. Dean dragged the chain step by step. Slowly, as he walked for a long time, his mind gradually recovered from Lorien's death. From time to time he would check the surrounding terrain to identify the direction. If you want to go to the Splitter's cave from outside the Scott giant wall, you will need to bypass the 3rd area. The monsters in the 3rd area of the Scott Consortium are generally level 15 to 23. You will need a senior hunter to ensure your safety. Dean's eyes lit up as he dragged the chain along area number 3. Soon he came to a ruin. The asphalt road on the ground had long been cracked and covered with weed. There were ruins on both sides of the asphalt road. They were as quiet as skeletons in the night. Pythons and lizards crawled from time to time. Clang! Clang! The cage rolled on the ground, making a loud noise. Whoosh! A giant cat-like monster came from the dark. It jumped on a moss-covered car-shaped object. The top of the object cracked. The monster lightly jumped out and landed on the ground. It stared at Dean. Dean recognized that it was a difficult monster called Copperclaw Cat. It was a level 19 monster. It was very flexible. It could annihilate an intermediate hunter team if it was caught off guard. The little splitter in the cage seemed to feel the hostility. It suddenly stood up and roared in a low voice. The Copperclaw Cat retracted its claws when it heard the roar. It hesitated for a moment but suddenly turned around and jumped into the nearby ruins. It disappeared into the night. Dean was surprised. He didn't expect that these bloodthirsty and ferocious monsters would know fear. Squeak, squeak. Splitter scared the copper-clawed cat away, but it still roared in the direction it had gone. It's quite awe-inspiring. Dean chuckled as he pulled the chain and continued to move forward. Splitter turned its head and roared at Dean. Dean continued to move forward as if he hadn't heard the roar. Splitter screamed a few times. It was full of anger as it saw that Dean ignored it. Splitter's voice stopped after a few minutes as it saw that Dean didn't pay attention to it. From time to time it would hit the cage and vent its dissatisfaction. More than 2 hours later, Dean crossed the entire area number 3 and arrived at his own territory. He encountered a lot of monsters along the way. Some were scared away by the roar of Splitter while others were killed by Dean. It was easy for him to kill monsters below level 25 with his current combat power. Dean came to the cave of Splitter after another hour. "I'm taking you home." Dean looked at the little Splitter in the cage and said. Splitter roared at Dean as it heard his voice. Dean clapped his hands as he looked at the entrance of the cave. He was relieved. Although there were layers of boulders, but he could still see the amazing heat coming out of the boulders. It was obvious that Splitter was still alive. He looked at it for a while then turned away. Whether or not you can survive in the future will depend on your own luck. Dean looked at the struggling Splitter and said. He didn't care whether Splitter could understand or not. He spent a lot of effort to move the Splitter because he knew that there would be few opportunities for him to hunt outside the giant wall in the future. He planned to enter the inner wall to peep at the pinnacle of the world after the lecture. He wanted to unravel the many mysteries in his heart. He also wanted to find a way to deal with the military and the Holy Church. The foundation of these two forces was in the inner wall. Even if he destroyed the military and the Holy Church in the outer wall, it was difficult to guarantee that the inner wall wouldn't send forces to suppress him. The cruel isolation of the high wall made him know that there was a sky beyond the sky. Therefore, if he wanted to climb to the sky, he would have to break the sky beyond the sky. Otherwise, all the glory would turn to dust. The cave of Splitter was located in the middle of his domain. If he wanted to raise Splitter, he would have to ask Sergei to take care of it or let it find its own food. It could only be regarded as a small wrinkle. Behind the high wall was a vast plain. The plain stretched very far. There were mountains at the end. There seemed to be snow on the top of the mountain. There were lakes in the plain, but there were no villages or towns. Dean found it inconceivable that such a large area was empty. Even the most dilapidated slums in the outer wall wouldn't have such a large area that was empty. He suddenly thought of the shape on the map. The shock in his eyes slowly calmed down. The soil of the entire giant wall was occupied by the inner wall. Nearly 80% of the soil was in the inner wall. But the outer wall and the radiation area only accounted for 20%. This vast plain was a rare territory in the outer wall. But in the inner wall, perhaps it was a relatively unvisited wasteland. Dean decided to move forward. After walking for a while, Dean suddenly saw a huge shadow galloping in the grassland at the end of the plain. Behind the shadow, there was a very small sesame-like black grain chasing after it. Dean suddenly saw that the shadow in front of him was actually a huge monster that was more than 10 meters long. Its body was like a centipede with countless side feet, and its tail was high up like a scorpion with barbs. The person chasing the centipede monster turned out to be a very young boy, about 16 or 17 years old, almost the same age as Dean. His face still had the childish look of a teenager, holding a huge sword in his hand, chasing the centipede monster at full speed. Centipede! Dean was surprised. This was a level 22 monster. Moreover, it was a highly toxic monster. It was extremely difficult to deal with. Even an intermediate hunter would die if they encountered it. Even senior hunters wouldn't be willing to hunt this thing. If they were careless and got poisoned, most of the antidote would be difficult to save. Whoosh! All of a sudden, the youth chasing after it threw out a chain, clamping down on the barbs at the end of the 100-legged devil centipede's tail, pulling it back. The centipede struggled and swung its tail. It turned around and rushed towards the boy. The boy was holding a huge knife that was half the height of his body. He jumped up and stepped on the centipede's body. He cut a huge wound on the centipede's body. One man and one beast fought together. After a moment, the boy threw the huge knife and the centipede's head was cut off. The centipede suddenly stopped struggling. Its body slightly twisted. Dean was shocked. He didn't think that the people of the inner wall would be so strong. It was the first time that he saw someone of the same age as him. The boy pulled out the huge knife and tied the chain to the centipede's tail. He dragged the centipede away. Dean immediately followed the boy. He wanted to peep at the place where the boy lived. Suddenly, the boy stopped and looked back at the sky. Dean was shocked when he saw him turn his head. Chapter 427. Dean was relieved as he saw the youth turn around and continue to drag the centipede. He didn't expect the youth's senses to be so sensitive. He didn't know what would happen if the youth saw him. He also didn't know what kind of status the youth had in the inner wall. What level of strength did the dragon girl belong to in the inner wall? What surprised him the most was that there were monsters in the inner wall. Wasn't it similar to the outer wall? How could the monsters come to the inner wall? Wasn't it easy to annihilate the monsters in the inner wall with the strength of the dragon girl? He couldn't think of a reason, but he was glad that he hadn't rashly gone against the light church and the military. Otherwise, if he had forced these two forces into a corner, who knew what kind of trouble it would have brought? As the saying goes, if you want to deal with the Holy Church and the military, then you have to find a way to control their strength in the inner wall. There were some doubts in his heart as he thought of this. The last barbarian attack had put the commercial district in danger. The military should have asked for reinforcements from the inner wall. But there was no response from the inner wall. Did the inner wall not care about the life and death of the outer wall? Or did the military not ask for reinforcements from the inner wall? Did they have other cards up their sleeves? However, there was another possibility. It was that the barbarians did something so that the inner wall didn't send reinforcements. But it meant that the barbarians could contact the inner wall. There was a big background behind them. However, the barbarians lived in the radiation zone and the inner wall. There was an outer wall area between them. It was difficult to get in touch with the people in the inner wall. Perhaps it was the barbarians from the inner wall that colluded with the barbarians. But there were more problems. Dean frowned. He felt that the problem was a bit complicated and thorny. He thought of a person that he had missed, Yvette, who was imprisoned in the military. Dean looked up at the boy who was far away. He thought about it and put away the idea of continuing to follow him. At the moment the sun had risen and it was not early. He should go back. Moreover, with his current ability, it was not difficult to climb the giant wall. In the future there would be opportunities to come back and see. Gwyneth was waiting at the station. She leaned on the carriage and covered her face with a straw hat. Dudian hadn't returned after one night. She was puzzled. Although she had become Dudian's maid, she still felt that it was difficult to understand the boy. The latter always seemed to hide something from her, so she couldn't understand his real cards. Suddenly, a smell drifted over. Gwyneth lifted the straw hat and looked at Dudian. She put on the straw hat and indifferently said, "Are we going back now?" "There's no hurry. Let's eat something first." Dean peeled off the tarpaulin in his hand. There were several pieces of bread inside. He took out one and put it in his mouth. He handed the rest to Gwyneth. "Eat." Gwyneth was startled. She took one of them and said, "I can't eat so much." "You don't need to lose weight. You're already beautiful." Dean casually said a famous phrase and smiled. He handed the tarp to her and turned around to get into the carriage. Gwyneth was startled as she heard Dean's words. She silently put away the pieces of bread and shook the rope. The horse was startled and immediately neighed and ran away. As soon as he came to the front of the castle, Dean saw that the gate was surrounded by reporters from various newspapers. He could not help but raise his eyebrows. Suddenly, he thought of something. There were 3 days left before his lecture. It was estimated that the aristocratic circle of the entire commercial district was paying attention to every move here. Many people with better eyesight noticed the carriage. They withdrew from the gate like a swarm of ants. They moved towards the carriage. Gwyneth's expression was indifferent. She didn't have the slightest intention to slow down. She shook the rope and the carriage rushed forward at a faster speed. The people who came to encircle Dean were scared and hurriedly moved to the side. Although the interview was profitable, but their lives were the most important. Moreover, if they were injured or killed by Dean's hooves, they wouldn't be able to receive compensation for their injuries. Not to mention that the genius master would use his life to compensate for their injuries. Noyce, who was guarding the gate, saw the carriage and opened the gate. The carriage rushed into the manor and stopped in front of the castle. Dean got off the carriage and shook his head as he heard the shouts from outside the manor. He entered the castle. "Master, you're back." Crone greeted him. Dennis and Glenn were sitting in the hall. They were enjoying breakfast. They got up and greeted Dean when they saw him. He went upstairs to change his clothes. He put on a soft and warm sweater and went back downstairs. He looked at Glenn, who had finished breakfast. "Go to the military and help me bring back a person. Her name is Yvette. She is the barbarian royal family member that I have arrested. The military has promised to hand her over to me after the interrogation. This is my medal." He handed his knight medal to her. Glenn was surprised. She didn't think that Dean's power was so big that he could get the barbarian royal family from the military. But she was relieved as she thought about the fact that Dean had donated the legendary item for free. She nodded. "I'll go now." Dean nodded and sat at the table. He called Crone to serve the meal. After 10 minutes, a sumptuous breakfast was served on the table. Dennis was speechless when he saw the ingredients of the breakfast. He didn't think that Dean would eat so extravagantly even though he lived in such a simple house. Dean felt a lot warmer after breakfast. The biting cold feeling was dispelled. He went back to the study room to study the medical knowledge and exercise the flexibility of his left hand. He suddenly thought of the teenager he saw in the morning. He called Crone. "Go and send a message to the old man. Tell him to buy parasitic soul worms from the temple or the black market. The more precious the better." Dudian commanded. Now that he had power and wealth, he didn't need to personally go outside the giant wall to hunt. He only needed to spend money to buy them. Not only could he pick the type of parasitic soul worm that he liked, but the efficiency was also high. Outside the giant wall, to encounter a named monster, all depended on luck. Sometimes he would squat for a few months and he might not be able to find one. As for rare monsters, the probability was even lower. "Yes, young master." Crone thought for a while and was ready to leave. "Wait." Dean stopped him. "By the way, tell the old man to spread the news that I need parasitic soul worms. If other nobles are willing to provide rare parasitic soul worms, then they will have the opportunity to get a place as my student. If they provide rare parasitic soul worms, then they will get a place as a student and I will cultivate them wholeheartedly. Crone was startled for a moment. His eyes flickered as he replied, I know. Afternoon. Dennis came back with a tall woman with wheat-colored skin. There was a big difference between the women in the giant wall. The barbarians in the radiation zone were generally tall and burly. Even the women were no exception. Yvette's height was the same as most regular knights. She was about 1.75 meters. Compared with the women in the giant wall, she was almost a crane in a flock of chickens. Even most of the men in the giant wall didn't have such a height. In addition to the figure, the skin color was also very different. Even the women in the slums who didn't bathe all year round didn't have such a skin color. Although the body was dirty, but at least the face could be seen. Yvette obviously had a problem with her skin color. Chapter 429. The fragrance of tea filled the study room. Dean stared at Yvette as he asked all the questions in his mind. He listened to her answers while paying attention to her heart and the blood vessels in her body. He could clearly see the heartbeat of the latter under the thermal vision. This would help him to detect if she was lying. Inner wall? I don't know about it. Even if there is, I have no right to ask about it. Yvette replied honestly. Dean looked at her heartbeat. He nodded. All right, my questions are over. I didn't expect you to be the little princess of the barbarian royal family. I will take revenge for you. Biting her lips, Yvette's eyes flashed with a trace of resentment. I hope to kill them in the most vicious way possible. No problem. Dudien readily agreed. Yvette stared at him. How do you know that? They did that to me? Dean saw that there was a trace of shame in her voice. The coldness in his eyes softened a bit. I believe that any senior hunter would be able to smell the dirty smell on your body. Go and take a bath. Yvette was startled and her face turned pale. She subconsciously covered her lower abdomen with her hands, but then she realized that this action was indecent. She gritted her teeth and said, I'll go first. Dudien got up and opened the door. He called out to Crone in the corridor. Crone ran up. Master, take her to take a bath. Dean said. Yes. Crone immediately turned his head and said to Yvette, Miss, please. Dean's eyes lit up as he watched Yvette leave with Crone. According to Yvette, their ancestors came from the inner wall, but because of the war they were expelled to the outer wall. Later they were expelled to the radiation zone. They stayed in the radiation zone for more than 200 years. At that time the giant wall of the inner wall was built. There are consortiums involved in the war. In addition to Mellon Consortium, Huasheng, Green and Scott Consortium are involved. The merchants won't move if there is no profit. There is no need to worry about the collapse of the inner wall. Dean narrowed his eyes. The military should be aware of this point, but they couldn't investigate it. If he didn't take the initiative, then the military wouldn't be able to bring down the Mellon Consortium even if they got the evidence. It seemed that there was a contradictory balance in the seemingly complex situation. Perhaps this was what the inner wall wanted? Unfortunately, Yvette was just a little princess of the king of barbarians. Although she was talented in fighting, in the barbarian social system, women were forbidden to participate in military discussions. According to her, although her father was the chief of all tribes and the king of all barbarians, there were more than 50 children of the king of barbarians. Yvette was ranked 27th among the daughters, and she had 5 younger sisters, the youngest of whom had just learned to walk. If she was a man, then she would be able to touch the top secrets of the barbarians. Time flew by. 2 days passed. In the blink of an eye it was the day of Dean's public lecture. In the last 2 days old Foulin had sent the parasitic soul worms for Dean to choose from. There were 16 parasitic soul worms. Most of them were ordinary parasitic soul worms. They could be used as magic marks to become ordinary hunters. The transformation of the body was weak and the increase in strength wasn't big. Moreover, their ability was relatively ordinary. They could make the body more resistant to heat or hunger, but their role in combat was negligible. In addition to the ordinary parasitic soul worms, there were 4 rare parasitic soul worms. They could be used as hunters. Dean was surprised that there was a rare parasitic soul worm among the 16 parasitic soul worms. This rare parasitic soul worm came from the swallower. It was at the same level as the magic marks of the infected. Its ability was to provide a strong digestive ability. Not only could it digest the flesh and blood of the undead, which contained viruses, but it could also digest the flesh and blood of poisonous monsters. Its intestines could be said to be immune to poison. It could eliminate most of the viruses, bacteria, and parasites. In addition, it could also digest metals, poisonous plants, bark, stones, and so on. Of course, he needed to reach the level of a senior hunter in order to evolve such a high-level ability. In addition to the terrifying digestive ability, the swallower magic mark also had a good attack effect. The strong acid in the stomach could be shot out through the tip of the tongue to attack the enemy. As long as it was an intestine devourer magic mark hunter, the tongue would gradually evolve into a hollow tube, connected to the stomach, and could use the strong acid in the stomach to make a sneak attack, which often had a miraculous effect in the battle. This is the swallower parasitic soul worm. I will give it to you, Noise. Dean called Jean and handed him the gray parasitic soul worm. Train well in the future and learn from Sergei and Gwyneth. Now your starting point is the same as them. Noise looked at the gray parasitic soul worm. Young master, this is a rare parasitic soul worm. I have my own magic mark. Dean laughed. It was a waste to use the rare parasitic soul worm as a promotion material. Ordinary parasitic soul worm was enough. Crone's expression turned ugly, but it soon disappeared. He looked at Noise and said, Young master gave it to you. Take it. Noise came back to his senses. He took the box and bowed. Young master, you are the one who pulled my life out of prison. Scar and I swore allegiance to you. I will do the same in the future. No matter what you ask me to do, I am willing to die. Dudian laughed. Well then you should die now. Noise almost choked. He looked up in shock. Don't be so mushy. Go. Dean waved his hand. Noise reacted and his face turned red. He saluted again and then left. Dean looked at Crone. Which family gave the swallower magic mark? Who is the person they recommended? Crone turned around and handed over the register in his hand. Dean took a look and wrote down the name. You go out first. Tomorrow is the day of my lecture. Prepare for it. Yes, young master. Crone looked at the 4 bottles of rare parasitic soul worms on the table. After he left, Dudian closed the window and added a few pieces of dry wood to the fireplace. Then he sat by the fireplace and took off his coat, exposing his upper body. His skin was as white as snow, but his body was covered with intricate whip marks and sharp blade scars. Some of the scars were shocking, especially the steel nail scars on his shoulder blade, which still left a round scar. His divinized magic mark was in the middle of these scars on his chest. It was like a sharp sword lying across his chest. Dean gently touched for a moment and picked up the parasitic soul worm next to him. He began to absorb the parasitic soul worm from the ordinary ones. He was already at the limit of intermediate level before he got the magic mark. His physique had reached the bottleneck. It was useless to absorb more God's blessings because the magic mark was connected to the body. God's blessings were not to strengthen the body but to strengthen the magic mark. The magic mark had stages. When a stage reached saturation, it was necessary to use the body of other parasitic soul worms as nourishment to step into the next stage. Dean took out the ordinary parasitic soul worm from the bottle and injected it into the magic mark on his chest. 1, 2, 3. Chapter 430. In the blink of an eye, Dean injected 5 parasitic soul worms into the magic mark on his chest. The magic mark only bulged a little, and then calmed down at a very slow speed. Dean raised his eyebrows. Generally, a hunter only needed 4 parasitic soul worms to promote from intermediate to senior level. If he was unlucky, 5 or 6 would be enough. Unless he was extremely unlucky, he needed 7 or 8 to satisfy his magic mark's appetite. Looking at his situation now, it seemed that he belonged to the category of extremely unlucky people. After injecting 5 parasitic soul worms, there was no feeling at all. Dean could only continue to inject. Anyway, with his current status, it was easy to get parasitic soul worms. He just needed to hook his finger, and someone would send them to him. He didn't need to squat outside the giant wall to hunt for parasitic soul worms. If he didn't get the magic mark, he would become a monster's meal. 6, 7, 8, 9 With the ingestion of more and more parasitic soul worms, Dean finally felt a slight pulse in the magic mark on his chest. It seemed to be slightly trembling. This was a precursor of evolution. He was surprised and continued to inject parasitic soul worms. In the blink of an eye, he injected 2 parasitic soul worms. The magic mark on his chest trembled more and more intensely. At the same time, it emitted a heat that spread throughout his body. His body, which was originally cold, seemed to have warmed up under this hot current. It seems that it's not enough. Dean stared at the magic mark on his chest. He waited for a moment, but found no other movement. He couldn't help but be speechless. He was not extremely unlucky, but extremely unlucky. Was it because of the legendary magic mark? He looked at the remaining 4 rare parasitic soul worms and hesitated for a moment. Finally, he clenched his teeth and grabbed a bottle. He took out a green parasitic soul worm and injected it into his magic mark. Although using rare parasitic soul worms to promote his soul worm was an absolute wastrel, Dean didn't care so much. These things could be bought again. For him, he could easily exchange them for any kind of invention. If he continued to wait for others to send him ordinary parasitic soul worms, the time was too slow, and he was not sure if someone would send them. And he never liked to wait. With the injection of this rare parasitic soul worm, Dean suddenly felt the heat in his chest boiling, as if he was suddenly ignited by a fire. His whole body felt a burning sensation, and his pores expanded, oozing out a lot of sweat. Dean took a light breath. He had this feeling that the breakthrough was imminent. He grabbed another bottle and took out a rare parasitic soul worm and injected it into his magic mark. Suddenly, his whole body felt like it was about to explode. He felt as if his brain had been hit by a volcano. His mind was full of heat and his consciousness was blurred by this heat. However, he could vaguely feel that there seemed to be something twisting in his chest. When he felt this, he suddenly remembered the time when he had absorbed the splitter's parasitic soul worm. The parasitic soul worm had tried to drill into his brain. Suddenly, his pores shrank and his whole body was frightened. He looked down and saw that the shape of the magic mark on his chest was changing. If it was a small sword mark before, then now it was like a finger-long sword chopstick in the middle of his chest. The change of the magic mark meant that the promotion was successful. Dean took a deep breath. He felt that his whole body was hot, wet, and full of sweat. He pulled the towel next to him to dry his body. He felt that his hand was very light, as if his arm suddenly became thousands of pounds lighter. His thoughts moved, and his arms stretched out unexpectedly. I don't know if there are any new abilities after being promoted to senior hunter. There was a glimmer of expectation in Dean's eyes. Compared to his own physical increase, he was more looking forward to the new ability. If it was a better ability, the effect would be much greater than brute force. However, life was not a game after all. There was no attribute list. He could only slowly explore it. Fortunately, he had learned how to explore his own ability when he deified the magic mark last time. This time, he still did the same, starting from his eyes. When he was ready to experiment with his eyes, he suddenly found a strange thing. He could actually see the cabinet. He was facing the fireplace at the moment. The cabinet was behind him, but he could see it. Dean was startled and suddenly overjoyed. He turned his head and faced the cabinet. He suddenly saw the fireplace behind him, and the flame inside was strong. The angle of my field of vision has expanded? Dean touched his eyelids. It was incredible. He suddenly thought of something. He quickly ran to the mirror and looked at himself. In the mirror, his eyes were like a human's. They weren't protruding out. He was relieved. But soon he noticed that there was a very light green color in his eyes. This touch of green was in the middle of the pupil. Dean looked closer and blinked. Yes, there was a touch of green in both of his eyes. Sure enough, the structure of the eyeball has changed. Fortunately, it's not big. Dean was a little relieved. As the ability of the hunters improved, their body would be subtly changed by the magic mark. It could be said that any senior hunter would have a part of their body that was different from a human. For example, Sergei had scales on his back. This was the result of his steel dragon magic marks. As for the other hunters, some of them had extremely long teeth that were exposed outside their mouths like ferocious fangs. Some of them had oddly colored, brightly colored hair. Some of them had skin like crocodile skin, rough and hard. Some of them had fingers that were like beast claws, long and ugly. All of the hunters' bodies would change. As their strength increased, more and more parts of their bodies would change. Many of them had mutated parts on the surface which made them look like monsters. This was the reason why hunters always lived in the dark. They were rejected by the nobles and feared by the civilians. My vision is a bit like that of an insect, but the surface structure of the eyeball is still the same as that of a human. There is no protrusion, and the eyelids have not degenerated. Dean looked down at his body, looking for other parts of the mutation. When he concentrated, he suddenly found that his line of sight seemed to fall into a bloody world. Suddenly, the scene in front of him changed, and he saw a skeleton. And this skeleton was him. He was so shocked that he almost fell down. When he moved his gaze away from this strange scene, his mood calmed down a little, and his pupils seemed to relax. When he looked again, he suddenly found that the skeleton from before was gone, and it was still himself made of flesh and blood. Dean was startled for a moment. Suddenly he was overjoyed. His vision seemed to have gone a step further. He could directly see the bone marrow. Moreover, the most important thing was that he seemed to be able to control his vision. It was not fixed like before. Otherwise, he would see everyone as a skeleton. It was no different from living in a kingdom of the undead. The most important thing was that he would get face blindness. The angle of sight seems to be more than 270 degrees. I can also see the skeletons inside the body. It belongs to the medium-high perspective ability, and I can control it freely. Dean was pleasantly surprised. It must be known that although a normal person's single-eye field of vision was about 150 degrees, the area where the two eyes overlapped was the area where people could see clearly. This area was 120 degrees. In most cases, people could only see clearly in the 90-degree range. The more focused the attention, the smaller the field of vision. Usually, when the attention was focused on one thing, the field of vision would be reduced to less than 1/5. Chapter 431. Splitter is an extreme attack-type monster. There is such a big change in vision. I guess the improvement in combat would be even stronger. Dean couldn't help but look forward to it. He tested smell and hearing one by one according to the previous experiment sequence. Through the experiment, Dean found that his hearing and smell were still confused. When he pinched his nose, he could distinguish the sourness, sweetness, bitterness and spiciness of the smell through his hearing. When he blocked his ears, he could smell the sound emitted by the smell. It was not much different from before, but the intensity had increased. The range was nearly twice as wide as before. He could clearly smell the many smells mixed in the air, and the subtle sounds from all over the castle, including a corner of the kitchen. There was a squeaking sound of something small gnawing on a hard object. It should be a mouse hiding there. Dean was disappointed that there was no new change in his hearing and smell. But after thinking for a while, he was relieved. Splitter was an extreme attack-type monster. Its high-speed movement and attack required keen vision. But the need for smell and hearing was not so strong. Dean moved his body. After the test, he found that his physical strength was more than twice as strong as before. His wrist strength and grip strength were surprisingly strong. He could easily bend hard metal tools out of shape. Generally, when an intermediate hunter is promoted to a senior hunter, my physical strength will double. Some of them will increase by 1.5 times. According to the Dragon Girl, an intermediate hunter can hunt monsters around level 11 to 19. A more powerful intermediate hunter can hunt monsters around level 20. A senior hunter can hunt monsters around level 28 or 29. When I was an intermediate hunter, I was able to easily kill a level 27 monster. I didn't even have to rely on close combat skills. This means that my physique can cope with a level 30 monster, which is the limit of a senior hunter. Now I should be able to kill a level 40 monster. If I improve my combat skills, then I can kill a level 45 monster. Dean's eyes flashed. There was no modern punching machine here. He could only use the monsters outside the giant wall as a reference to evaluate his physical strength. But it was convenient. After all, the meaning of the existence of a hunter was to hunt monsters. It was more valuable to know the level of monsters he could kill than to know his specific strength. My magic marks are still at the senior hunter stage, but the increase in strength is far stronger than ordinary senior hunters. The Dragon Girl was sent to hunt level 68 mature Splitter. I am still far from her. However, if the magic mark evolves again, maybe I can barely catch up with her. The potential of a deified legendary magic mark is stronger than her, unless she also has a deified legendary magic mark. Thinking of this, the surprise in Dean's heart gradually calmed down. He looked down at his abdomen, and his pupils seemed to adjust slightly after being oppressed. Suddenly, he saw the bones and internal organs in his abdomen, as well as the white ice in his abdomen. However, in the range of 270 degrees of vision, he found that in addition to his abdomen, there was also a large piece of white ice in his left arm. The bones of his left arm seemed to be a bit transparent, like the structure of ice cubes. Seeing this, Dean was slightly surprised. Suddenly, he realized that perhaps the main reason for the abnormality in his abdomen came from his left arm. His abdomen was infected with a large amount of blood from other monsters. It was just a fuse that caused the changes in his abdomen. Otherwise, it was impossible to explain why his left arm turned into white ice while his right arm didn't have the slightest change. My left arm was directly absorbing the cold crystal. It was eroded by the cold and spread to my abdomen. So, the ice blood disease should be caused by the direct absorption of the cold crystal. Dean fell into thought. After a long time, he slowly recovered his thoughts and looked down at his body. Previously, he saw that he was full of bones, so he didn't take a closer look. Now he looked one by one and suddenly found that there were very strange changes in his body. First of all, the position and number of bones. He had seen the normal structure of human bones in the superchip, but his bones were somewhat deformed. It seems that there are 2 more forearm bones in my arm. The phalanges have become thinner, and there is a small phalange bone next to it. Dean looked at his body while trying to move his fingers. He grasped the bent metal tools next to him. Suddenly, he found that when he exerted force in his fingers, the small phalanges next to the phalanges were like a bracket supporting the phalanges, so that the phalanges could easily burst out a powerful force. Dean was startled and then came to his senses. No wonder I'm only a senior hunter, but my strength and speed are far beyond that of ordinary senior hunters. At the genetic level, I'm still a senior hunter, but the abnormal structure inside my body allows me to exert stronger strength and speed. Dean thought in his heart. The same material, different structure, played different effects. Compared to ordinary human beings, the structure of his body seemed to be much better. But these changes only enhance the physique. It seems that there are no other combat abilities. Dean looked at his whole body in doubt. Splitter was a monster with extreme attack. But in addition to the obvious changes in vision, there didn't seem to be any other changes in combat. This feeling was a bit strange. In terms of ability, his senses had greatly improved. Compared to other senior hunters who were good at perception, he was in no way inferior or even stronger. But perception was only incidental to Splitter. Like other combat-type hunters, some could control blood. Some were like Glenn, who had black weaver magic marks. She could burrow into the ground and shrink pores to hide her breath. Some were like the infected, who could enhance their sense of smell and immunity, as well as the ability to absorb cold crystals and night vision. But for now, the divinized Splitter magic marks didn't give him many abilities. Even fewer than the rare magic marks. Is it possible that the ability has evolved, but I haven't noticed it? Can't the ability be stimulated by ordinary tests? Dean thought in his heart. If this was the case, then maybe he would be able to stimulate the ability when he encountered a well-matched opponent. After all, some abilities would be instinctively displayed in times of crisis. Temple of Elements, Drudge Mountain, Blessed Forest. The castle extended from Mount Degia to the front of the forest. The outermost edge was the divine castle where the apprentice oracles and primary oracles lived. As the hierarchy continued to the front of the forest, the divine castle outside the forest was the divine castle of the deputy temple lord. It was magnificent and the manor was vast. A large number of temple staff were taking care of the strange flowers and plants in the manor, as well as the strange trees. There was a lonely castle by the lake in the depths of the forest. It wasn't large and the construction wasn't magnificent. There were some common fruits and vegetables planted in the manor. There was no staff of the temple to take care of them. There was an old man wearing ordinary linen clothes. He was carrying a kettle and was watering the manor. He was taking care of the vegetables. He was holding a small hoe in his hand. He was removing the weeds next to the vegetables. He looked like an old fruit farmer. Woo! Suddenly, a giant black shadow jumped out from the back of the manor and rushed towards the old fruit farmer. It was a giant leopard dog. It was nearly 3 meters tall and had strong limbs. There was no fat on its body. There were brown spots all over its body. There was a sharp horn on the top of its head. Its eyes were dark golden amber. It was full of killing intent. It moved as fast as lightning and arrived in front of the old fruit farmer in the blink of an eye. It opened its mouth but didn't bite the old fruit farmer. Instead, it jumped in front of the old fruit farmer. It was like a watchdog as it roared towards the outside of the manor. The old fruit farmer was in the middle of weeding when he saw this. He paused for a moment and raised his blurry eyes to look outside the manor. Lightning Sprout. Wow. A rare monster has been tamed to such an extent. Good job of the temple master. A burst of applause echoed from the depths of the forest. A tall figure slowly came out from the shadows. Roar! The giant black beast let out a low roar, full of demonstration. The old fruit farmer put down the kettle and straightened his body. His previously dim eyes seemed to shoot out 2 rays of cold light. He slightly narrowed his eyes and calmly said, "The war is over. What do you want from the inner wall?" At this moment, the figure in the shadows had completely walked out. It was a handsome young man, holding a 2-meter-long wooden stick in his hand. He wore an extremely simple white robe, which was like a huge bedsheet, curling his body sideways. The hand and shoulder that held the stick were exposed outside the robe. He looked like a monk, but he had a head of elegant golden hair. Chapter 432. Roar. The black monster, the lightning sprout, saw the young man approaching it. It suddenly took a few steps forward and roared ferociously. Electric sparks appeared on its forehead, and all of its hair stood up like a sharp hedgehog. The young man's expression did not change, but a ray of light suddenly flashed in his eyes. The wooden stick in his hand gently knocked on the ground, making a light sound. He still seemed to be standing casually, but his posture was already stretched, as if he would attack at any time. The thunder sprout growled. Just as it was about to rush out, its body suddenly stopped and its eyeballs moved back slightly. The old man who watered the vegetables earlier stroked the thunder sprout's fur and slowly walked out. "You want to bring a person?" The old man patted the lightning sprout and calmly looked at the youth. "Is it the child who has created a new legendary item?" The youth smiled and said, "I only know that his name is Dean." The old man stared at him and slowly retracted his eyes. He gently touched the ears of the lightning sprout. The lightning sprout screamed and jumped back into the manor. "He is a real genius. Are you sure you want to kill him?" The old man turned around and slowly entered the fortress behind the orchard. The young man smiled, pushed open the door of the manor, and followed. He said, "This is the order of the higher-ups. This person used the power of the devil. If it wasn't for his good comprehension, I would have purified him. This time, I'm just sending him to the monastery to let him think about it. If he knows what's good for him, then, if you want to take him, then take him." The old man interrupted him. His voice was emotionless as he said, "You'd better leave. I don't welcome outsiders here." The young man was slightly startled. One of his feet was in midair. He paused for a moment as he looked at the old man's gradually disappearing figure. After a moment of silence, he slowly retracted his foot, bowed slightly, and turned around to leave the manor. The sun rose. The warm sun shone on the church mountain. A new day had arrived. The bell echoed on the top of the mountain, pushing away the morning mist. On the steps at the foot of the mountain, a black dot the size of an ant was moving forward. It was actually countless oracles of the divine hall dressed in luxurious clothes, walking the steps to the largest church castle in Mount Degia. Today was also the day that Dean announced to teach. It was 9 in the morning. It was 7 o'clock at the moment. All the architects got up and rushed to St. Peter's Cathedral. This was the place where the masters of the Temple of Elements gave their lectures. Since it was a public lecture, the lecture venue was the square in front of the cathedral. The square was very vast. It was 185 meters long and 160 meters wide. It could accommodate 100,000 people. There were a total of 108 towering pillars around the square. The statues of angels and goddesses were engraved on them, looking magnificent and magnificent. There were many people gathered in the square. Naturally, there weren't more than 100,000 architects from the Temple of Elements, but there were 20 or 30,000 of them. The more they stood in the front, the clearer they could hear. At the moment they were scrambling for the most conspicuous position in the front. Not only could they hear Dean's words, but they could also be chosen by him. There are still 2 hours before the lecture starts, and there are already so many people here. I guess there are already more than 10,000 people? There was a trace of amazement in Ivisa's eyes as he looked at the noisy scene. In the past there were tens of thousands of people who came to listen to their master's public lectures. It was a big scene and it was worth to be proud of in front of other masters. But now it was nothing compared to the scene in front of him. Today is his first public lecture, so it is inevitable that it will attract a lot of people. I estimate that at least 10,000 people will come. The total number of people in our temple is only around 30,000. He is going to become famous, a lean old man said with a complex expression. He was Arson who had a quarrel with Dean. Today he came with his friend Ivisa to watch the lecture. Ivisa sighed. Even the 2 of us have come. If the little guys don't come, then they will be too unmotivated. Arson's mouth twitched. I want to see what he is going to say. Being able to create inventions doesn't mean that he can explain them. Teaching is a test of the accumulation of professional knowledge. He has just become a master, but he dares to teach in public. He is arrogant. If he had studied in the library for 3 years, then maybe he would have become a useful person. Ivissa knew that there was still resentment in his heart. He shook his head and whispered, "He has already become a useful person." Arson choked and his face darkened. "Hey!" At this time a figure came from the side. It was a square-faced old man. He was wearing casual clothes. He smiled at the two. "You two old guys also came? Do you want to see his lecture?" Ivissa looked up as he recognized the person. "Master Peter, you have come. What's the reason for us not to come?" Arson's face was still gloomy as he saw the old man. He turned his head and pretended not to notice. The square-faced old man walked over and said with a smile, "If he hadn't said that he would teach 10 days in advance, I really wouldn't have the time to come. I've been busy for a long time for this day. Now I've brought a few of my good-for-nothing students here to take a look." Ivissa laughed. "You are too polite. Carrie and Casper are senior architect. I estimate that it will take less than 2 years for them to become new masters. Your ability to teach students is the best among us." "I'm flattered." The square-faced old man laughed. Arson frowned. "It's useless to become a new master. If it wasn't for Dean, then they would be able to shine. But now that he has come out, the others will become foils." There was a trace of embarrassment on Ivissa's face. The square-faced old man's face slowly turned gloomy. He looked at Arson. "I heard that you had a conflict with the legendary master? Why? You can't compete with him, so you want to pull us in?" Arson's face changed as he didn't expect the old man to be so direct. He couldn't help but get angry. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Ivissa smiled awkwardly. "It's just a joke. Don't take it seriously." The square-faced old man coldly snorted. "Don't say a word? I'm not the one who started it. Some people are jealous of others because they can't compare with others. They don't work hard all day and are jealous of others. How dare they provoke me? Ridiculous." Arson angrily said, "Who are you talking about? I'm jealous of him? When I became famous, he was still in his mother's womb." The square-faced old man sneered. "You are old yet you want to compete with a child. Do you know that he wasn't born when you became famous? But now that you're about to be buried, you've been surpassed by others. You." Arson's body trembled in anger. The square-faced old man looked at him with a face full of mockery. "What are you two arguing about?" A voice echoed from the side. A thin old man came over. It was Skagen. Ivissa saw him and quickly said, "You persuade them." Skagen came over and looked at both of them. "Today is the big day of Dean's lecture. We shouldn't make trouble here. We should be happy that new seeds are growing in the new season. We have a legendary master in the temple. He will drive the temple in the future and completely change the life of the outer wall." The square-faced old man looked at him and smiled. "I think so too, but I hate it the most when people speak ill of others behind their back. Trying to sow discord? Really dirty. Humph, he's already so old, yet he doesn't practice any magic all day. I don't know what he's thinking. He made a name for himself when he was young, but when he's old, he only knows how to gnaw on the mountain of gold he earned when he was young. He likes to bully the younger generation when he has nothing better to do, and he always talks about respecting his elders. Such a person, the value of his life that he created when he was young is wasted when he's old." "You!" Arson glared at him. Skagen smiled and said, "All right, don't talk too much. Don't let the children laugh at you. A master should act like a master." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.